Okay, so I will get started basically, everyone. Really kind of welcome to this event. It's hosted basically by the BAFTSS, the British Association of Film and Television Studies, the Special Interest Group Performance and Stardom. I'm Sarah Thomas. I'm one of the conveners of the group. Eleonora Sammartino is another one as well. You might be able to kind of see her waving up there in the corner kind of through this. We've really kind of started this event, this new event, the In Conversation strand, basically, and we're really happy to welcome Martin Shingler to start of it, to celebrate the launch of his brand new book, Diana Dors, Film Star and Actress, that's through Edinburgh University Press. Sorry, Film Star and Actor, isn't it? I've got that one, yeah. Martin's very generously got a discount code and flyer for the book as well, so we will try and circulate that again after the event for you. And just really as a kind of introduction really to both our speakers today, we wanted to kind of set up an In Conversation event that allowed discussion from it. And we're going to start with two voices and hopefully expand it kind of to all of you as well as we go along. So just to introduce Martin, if you don't already know Martin, formerly from the University of Sunderland, but very much now going an independent route, much like a lot of the people he writes about around this. He's a leading voice in performance studies and star studies, and has been really important in really raising the profile of that we must look at screen acting when we look at stars and performers around us. So a very kind of important figure. He's edited the BFI Film Star series, which has many wonderful volumes in it, and also wrote Star Studies, a critical guide as well. And he's the author of countless things, most recently Before Diana Dors, when Warner's brought Broadway to Hollywood through Palgrave. And you probably know as well that he's done many writings on Betty Davis too. So he's turned his attention to the blonde bombshell instead. And we wanted to bring him together with Melanie Williams, who's a professor of film and television studies at the University of East Anglia. Now, Mel focuses particularly on British cinema and gender, and she's covered everything from Mamma Mia to Shane Meadows in doing so. And she's recently completed the project Transformation and Tradition in 60s British Cinema. But in 2017, she published Female Stars of British Cinema, which is also with Edinburgh Press. And this included a chapter on Diana Dors. There you go, Martin is holding it up for you there. So we thought this was a great opportunity to bring the two of you together. Now in this, we want an informal and hopefully kind of dynamic discussion around Dors and related topics. So we've structured it in a conversation way. I've basically pinned Martin and Melanie to your screen, and I'll disappear in a second, just as a way of kind of maintaining that really. But what we'd really like, and certainly Martin is very keen, that if at any point during this discussion you have comments or questions or even just stories and gossip about Diana Dors, please do interject in any way. We will have a kind of structure that is basically 45 minutes of discussion at least, and then we will make sure that there's space at the end for a half an hour of questions. But this is informal. If you want to come in before that, please do, either by unmuting yourself or raising your hand or putting a question in the chat, and I'll be fielding of everything there. So I will notice you basically. And that's it really. So I am going to disappear and hand over to Melanie and Martin. Thank you. Thank you all for coming as well.
Thank you. Thanks, Sarah. Thanks for introducing us both. And I'm absolutely thrilled to be invited to be part of this conversation, to launch a blinking brilliant book. It's absolutely wonderful. I've really enjoyed it. There's so much wonderful analysis and scholarship in there, and so many interesting things that I'm really excited to talk about. I wanted to start off, Martin, by asking, a sort of fundamental question, really. What made you want to write a book about Diana Dors?
I've been wanting to write a book about Diana Dors since at least 2009. In fact, when I put together the proposal for the BFI Film Stars books with my colleague Susan Smith at Sunderland University, I was going to do a book on Diana Dors and she was going to do a book on Elizabeth Taylor. But after we'd submitted the proposal, the commissioning editor came back and said, look, actually what's missing from this series and what we think you need is what was called a mother volume, which would map out the terrain of star studies so that each of the individual authors we commissioned to write a book on a particular star didn't have to rehearse the same arguments over and over again. And so one of us had to write that volume. So we drew straws and I lost. So that's how this book came into being.
And a very good book it is too.
Bless you, darling. But that meant that poor old Diana got knocked off my agenda. But what I did rather cannily, I think, was to put Diana into two of the chapters. So there's a chapter here on publicity and promotion, and she figures as a case study. And then the final chapter is about the kind of social relevance and representative nature of film stars. And I have a section on sex symbols. And guess who's my main case study as a sex symbol? It's Diana Dors. So I did get her in there. And then after that, once that was published, I started to give a series of papers on Diana Dors in Melbourne and in Amsterdam and in the UK. And I actually got a really terrific reaction wherever I went. And one of my questions at the end of each paper was, should I write a book on Diana Dors for the Star series? Should it get extended beyond its original 12 books? And people said, yeah, it'd be fantastic. We would love that. So that kind of kept it alive. And when Bloomsbury took over the series in 2018, I thought, aha, at last, this is my chance, because we were going to really expand the series and I was going to do a Dors book. And I was all primed by this. I'd more or less mapped out how I was going to write the book at this point. But in their great wisdom, they decided not to commission any more books for the series, having acquired it. And that kind of yet again left Dors in the lurch. But this is kind of classic Dors, isn't it? You know,
I was going to say, it seems quite symptomatic of, you know, the career that you're writing about, that it's had all these deferrals and, you know, things.
Yeah, but I wasn't going to let it go, you know. So then Edinburgh University Press were developing this wonderful international film star series. And I thought, well, it's a slim chance, because I don't think they'll think about Dors as an international star. I think they'll think about her as a British star, and I don't think they will accept this. So in my proposal, I pushed quite hard on why I think she should be considered an international star above and beyond a British star. And they accepted it, and there we are. That was it. So it's a long story, and it's a series of kind of failures to make it happen. But, you know, persistence paid off, and I sort of got there in the end.
Yeah, which seems quite a Dorsian story to tell, really.
Absolutely. Mm.
So there's this kind of burning urge to write something, you know, long form and detailed about Dors, but I'm wondering why that was. What was it about her that made you think, I really want to explore this person's career and their acting in more depth?
Yeah, I think partly because she's so different to Bette Davis, you know, and I've written so much about Bette, and Betty's been such a huge part of my life since I was about 20. And so much of my, you know, academic work as a student and a postgraduate student, and then as a professional academic, has been about Bette. And I love writing about Bette, but she is exhausting. And, you know, she does take over your life. And you really have to do your absolute best to do her justice. And she'd kind of, again, she'd sort of knocked Dors off the agenda, because as I say in the preface to the book, when I was 15, Dors popped into my life in quite a dramatic way. When I was sitting watching TV with my parents in the living room, and they were watching, as they always did, the two Ronnies, which I could take it or leave it. But suddenly this series that extended across the 8th series of the two Ronnies appeared, called The Worm That Turned, in which the two Ronnies, Ronnie Corbett, Ronnie Barker, are forced to wear floral frocks and do domestic jobs, and they're kept in their place by women and a kind of all-female police force in leather hot pants, and the whole thing is run by this militaristic but very camp figure of Diana Dors as the commander. And when she appeared right at the start in this kind of boardroom surrounded by all these august portraits of women, with Ronnie Corbett serving tea to these important women in the background, it just captured my imagination. And I thought, this is brilliant. I don't think I found it particularly funny. I just thought,
weirdly compelling.
Weirdly compelling. But then what compounded that was the following year, she suddenly, as I was sitting on a Thursday night this time with my parents watching Top of the Pops, as of course we always did, it was part of our religion, then Adam and the Ants video turns up for Prince Charming and storms to #1 and stays there for weeks on end. And who's in that video? But Diana Dors, you know, in this glittery frock, waving a magic wand that transforms his rags into this wonderful dandyish costume that enables him to go to just about the queerest costume ball I've ever seen in my life. And I thought, that's what I need at this moment in my life. You know, at 15, I just need this incredibly glamorous woman. She can be middle-aged, she can be slightly overweight, I don't care, but I need this woman to make an intervention in my life, wave the wand and sweep me off to this fabulous place full of drag queens and supermodels, and you know, we can all dress up and be silly and have fun.
Yes,
so
and ridicule is nothing to be scared of.
Not ridicule is nothing to be scared of. And that became my mantra, you know, stop worrying yourself sick and hiding in your bedroom. Get out there, and if people laugh at you, they laugh at you. It's fine, don't worry about it. So it really resonated. But I think it's the combination of the commander in her her powder blue military uniform, but very powerful and stern, with the fairy godmother figure that just did something that I couldn't quite fathom it. And so but it was important to me on both levels. And so it just sowed this seed. So there I was, and I went away to university and I was primed, and I could have started doing some work on Diana Dors, but then Betty took over. And Diana just got forced off the agenda for a very, very long time.
So she keeps being sort of usurped by these bigger Hollywood stars, whether it's...
But she popped up on my MA, you see. So I went off to do my MA in 1988. And one of my tutors at UEA, which you know all too well, was Charles Barr. And he'd just had a book out called All Our Yesterdays.
Which is,
of course, I'm sure you will have it on your shelf. And of course, my favourite chapter was the Diana Dors chapter by Christine Geraghty, which and that gave me a map, because suddenly that made sense of who Diana Dors was, because I'd seen her in her middle age and I'd sort of followed her on TV on all these panel shows and quiz shows and chat shows, and she was brilliant. And even followed her diet on TV AM.
Yeah.
But then she died. You know, she died in '84, but even at that point where she died, I don't think I really knew she'd been this sex bomb in the 1950s, or she'd started working in British cinema as a 15-year-old after the Second World War. None of this made, but it was Christine's essay that kind of put me right and set me off wanting to see Yield to the Night. And I was trying to think, when did I first see Yield to the Night? Was it on Channel 4 or was it at UEA? And I think I might have gone and looked at it at UEA, because it was probably on a VHS copy in the library. So so again, so she popped up, but of course, you know, I did my MA thesis on All About Eve, and then I did my PhD on Betty Davis, on the Betty Davis.
You took a different pathway.
Betty kept pulling me away and saying, no, work on me, I'm much more interesting. But it's interesting thinking about it, because it kind of never quite let go of Dors. She was sidelined, but she was in the margins of anything I was doing. And she's so different, you know. When I think about Betty, is acting personified, isn't she? And her whole star image is about being a brilliant actress, not terribly good looking, but my God, what she could do as an actress. Whereas Dors appears to be all about the glamour and the glitz and the beauty and looking fabulous, and acting is kind of neither here nor there, with that exception of Yield to the Night.
Yeah.
So it was thinking, right, well, if I do some work on Dors, this is going to open up a different way of thinking about stardom for me, which is much more about celebrity and glamour and looks and a different type of acting. And when I came into this project, I thought I was going to be looking at acting in terms of her being all sultry and pouty and, you know, and holding her body in particular ways and doing kind of pin-up things. But actually, that isn't really how she acts. You know, she's an incredibly naturalistic actor who is really nuanced, you know, which you've described actually really beautifully in your assessment of Yield to the Night in the Robert Murphy British cinema book. You know, when you talk about the last scene where she smokes the cigarette and she drinks the cup of tea, this is completely mundane. She's doing something really ordinary, and yet I think you describe the skin and her throat and the nuances, just everything is in microscopic detail, and even under that scrutiny, she is completely compelling, captivating, but really kind of ordinary.
Yeah.
That's the magic of her. Whereas Betty's totally theatrical. You know, she's on a different scale altogether. So she presents me with a very different star and a very different performer than the one I'm used to dealing with, and that's quite refreshing.
I think one of the things that is really interesting about your approach is that you're trying to reconcile these two different sides, but that are also interconnected, as you say, the idea of the actor and the film star. And Dors is a sort of especially piquant, interesting case study for trying to disentangle those two things through the different case studies that you use and examine. And I just wondered, what were you kind of left thinking about film stars and acting? Because in all the scholarship around performance, screen performance, you know, this is one of the real kind of thorny issues, isn't it? That idea of playing oneself, playing a version of oneself, embodying oneself perfectly, and that being the epitome of film performance. And I know you've kind of done such a lot of work in this area. What did the Dors deep dive study kind of leave you feeling about that, you know, film star actor dyad?
It's really challenged me in what I thought I knew about star acting, you know, and stars and acting. So, you know, star actors for me are actors who bring a lot of themselves into their role and they play the main character, you know, and they drive the film, and the film is sold on their name and their image. And then you've got character actors who tend to be much more kind of expressive because they've got to fight for their little moment on the screen, and because they only pop up for a minute, then, you know, they've got to draw attention to themselves, and they have this much more kind of vivid mode of expression. But, you know, Dors doesn't do that. So when Dors is in a minute of a film, like in It's Not Cricket in 1949, where she literally got one moment in a film, she is the most restrained performer on the screen. Her two stars, the main stars of the film, Norton and Wayne, are acting their socks off just like character actors, but she just brings everything down. She's just, you know, really kind of controlled. She acts like she's this great star, even though she's got a moment, and so a moment in the film. So it starts to undermine, for me, what I thought was a major gap between a star actor and a character actor, and she collapses these things. And when I track her performances throughout her career, through the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, I find she constantly does this, you know. And then I think when she's in a starring role where she dominates, then, you know, she, well, often she doesn't. She isn't the star, you know. She's the film's sold on the basis that she's the main protagonist, and then you watch it and you find she isn't the main protagonist at all. She's in a supporting role. She's only in the first 20 minutes of the film, and then she gets killed off, you know. So many, I mean, it's quite funny in that there's a whole set of DVDs which are boxed as Diana Dors collection, and nearly all of them, with the exception of Yield to the Night, she's in a supporting role or a small role, you know. I mean, whoever organized that was clearly hard pressed to find a series of starring roles for Dors. And so it made me think, she isn't really a star. She's this celebrity character actor. And I also realized she never quite had the bankability of a star to really guarantee investment or generate a huge audience for a film. So I started to feel she wasn't really operating as a star throughout her entire career.
Do you think some of that's got to do with the sort of failure of the imagination on the part of British cinema, that they know that that they've got this very powerful personality, but they don't know what on earth to do with her? So they, you know, end up pushing her to the side of the films that she's ostensibly a star performer in. It strikes me sometimes that looking at her and other female stars is there's a continual sense of, we don't know what to do with this person. We know that we could do something, but, you know, what? And these weird films often emerge from that.
Yeah, I think so. I think there was a sense that because there was so much scandal attached to her, that, you know, you never knew, she wasn't reliable enough. I think she was absolutely reliable as a professional who comes in prepared to do her job, having read the script, worked out her performance, doesn't waste anybody's time. I haven't come across anyone describing diva-ish behavior or anything that's held up filming. I think she was a very easy person to work with on a day-to-day basis, and her directors speak very highly of her. But I think for producers who want to guarantee, you know, that they can sell this film, what they worry about is, in the time it takes to make and release a film, which is going to take months, if Dors does something terrible in the tabloid press, or they get, you know, they've lost their film. They can't sell the film under her name because she's, you know, she's completely undermining. And it's not so much her, it's the people around her, isn't it? You know, it's the awful Dennis Hamilton, who I really didn't want to write about in the book.
Yeah.
You know, I just, oh, get him out of this story. He's a nightmare. So, you know, yeah, I think she moved about with the wrong people, and they brought her into disrepute, and the journalists had a field day. And I think it just meant that producers were too wary about her reputation. There was too much scandal.
Yeah, it kind of brings a lot of
Yeah, sorry, so could I just interject there and say, just for those of us who aren't as familiar, what were some of these scandals? Because I don't really know a lot of them. Could you give us a kind of cliff notes, perhaps?
Well,
yeah, do you really want us to tell you?
There's housebreaking in the early 50s, and she turns up in court wearing cigarette pants and gold sandals and no hats, and this is very notorious. There's all the stuff around
sex parties and
yeah, there's all of the
two-way mirrors or whatever. Yeah,
and she is one of the first people to sort of serialize her life in the tabloid in the early 60s. So Swinging Doors, first of her autobiographies, which I believe Martin's got on the table there. Excerpts of that are serialized in the News of the World, and this increases this sense of her notoriety. Also, when she goes to Hollywood, her husband chucks a photographer in the swimming pool, and this is seen as, you know, marking the end.
Beat him up brutally.
Yes,
got photographed and went into all the papers. Yeah.
So it's a hot mess of continual
bankruptcy.
Yeah, in and out, writs being served at your wedding reception for bankruptcy, all
leaving her 2 children behind in Beverly Hills and coming back to work in Britain.
3D semi-pornographic photos in the 1950s. Scandalous. So I mean, there's an awful lot, and I think that sense of celebrity and notoriety is a massively important part of the Dors celebrity brand, and it's one of the ways in which she can present herself as a survivor, that she's kind of gone through all these things and she's still here. But it does perhaps have an impact on the kind of acting career and that question of reliability and bankability that you were talking about, Martin. So, I mean, if you've got a life
an egg, isn't it? It's and kind of catch-22 in the fact that when she wasn't working, when the producers weren't giving her roles because they were worried about her, she had to do more of these kind of publicity stunts to keep her name and image in the newspapers so that people didn't forget about her. You know, she could go with whole years without doing any film. So she might do a bit of theatre or something, a bit of telly, you know, but, you know, she's kind of got to keep her star persona in public view. And all of this stuff gets dragged into it, doesn't it?
Yeah, the sex scandals, and the financial scandals as well. And one of the most interesting posthumous discoveries was kind of came out through a Channel 4 documentary that was talking about all these different bank accounts and different names that she'd set up with a kind of coded banking system, but one part of the code was missing, so it was impossible to be able to access all these, you know, individuated bank accounts that have been set up in all these different places across the UK. I mean, just incredibly inventive and clever, yeah. But also, you know, trying to get one over revenue and customs. So yeah, there's kind of ingenuity, but there's also a kind of association with things that are seen as a bit iffy. So that, yeah, all of that is going on. I mean, certainly when I was working on Diana Dors, I think in a way all of that kind of celebrity penumbra kind of took over, because there's so much of it and it's so intense and it's so rich and fascinating, and you know, the kind of tackiness of some of the funny publicity stunts. So, you know, she goes to open a door shop. So you get Diana Dors to open your shop that sells doors. You know, these kinds of low rent celebrity engagements. There's so many of these, and they're kind of fascinating. But I think one thing that they do obscure is exactly the thing that you're really focusing on and drawing attention to, which is that this is also a supremely talented screen performer.
Yeah, who's just forced into keeping her celebrity alive, because she doesn't really have a studio behind her for very long to do all of that work on her behalf. So, you know, and this is where I think the comparison with Marilyn Monroe is actually quite interesting, because Marilyn had 20th Century Fox behind her, which to some extent contained all of that stuff that you don't want out there in public. So she had publicists who would manage and do damage limitation for her. But also the studio would just keep putting her in films. They would find a role for her. They would, you know, keep her alive. And then if she did well, they would build it into a bigger part and then a bigger part. And, you know, she got the strategic build up to become a star, so that by 1953, she was a major star, having set out at roughly the same time as Dors in her career, about 46, 47, from being a pin-up. So very similar trajectory. But, you know, poor old Dors, she's at rank for like 2 years, 3 years tops. And then they drop her just as she's beginning to get going. And then the early 50s, she's completely left out into the cold, and she's reduced to doing provincial theatre tours. But that's when she bleaches her hair and starts doing all this publicity to get, you know, that's what that leads up really to the mink bikini on the gondola in Venice in 1955. Because, you know, and I think that's the extreme, isn't it, of how far she goes to draw attention to herself, not just in the British press, but in the world's press, to get the same kind of coverage that Marilyn Monroe is just really getting, because the 20th Century Fox publishers are constantly putting good stuff out there and containing and hiding away the bad stuff. So, you know, I mean, full credit to her for taking on the management of all that publicity and doing it for herself. But, you know, it can, because you're working with the tabloids, you know, what has changed? I mean, what's really interesting about her is she just seems to be so far ahead of the game. You know, what she's doing, what she was doing in the 50s, almost all stars and celebrities are doing now, aren't they? You know, it's really kind of pressing it.
Yeah, she's entrepreneurial. She curates her own celebrity image with no visible means of support. She's like the Skylon at the Festival of Britain. You know, she's just there, unsupported, doing it all herself, but managing to make an enormous impact, a big stir, to be the most talked about person, and to put noses out of joint because of that, because it's seen as kind of having ideas above your station, I suppose, to be quite candid about your ambition and the fact that, you know, it's time limited as well, that you've got so long to be a particular kind of star. You've got to make your money then, because you're not going to be able to in 5 years' time, because, you know, you'll be in a different place.
Yeah, she knew, and she said it over and over again, which was incredibly either brave or stupid of her. She knew by 1960, when she, you know, or certainly by 1961, when she hit 30, her career was going to be over. So, you know, she was very open right at the height of her career as a 25-year-old in 1956 of saying, you know, I know I'm not going to be here in 5 years' time. I've got to do it now, you know, and without a studio behind me, I've just got to do whatever I can do to get myself there. I can't afford to waste time.
We've just got a question from Jacob, who I think would like to come in at this point, if you're okay to do that.
Yeah.
Hey, sorry, I hope I'm not interrupting. I have two questions. One is pretty much what you've been talking about, which is when I was actually at UEA, not as a student or anything, but I had a fellowship there this year looking through the great theater archives, and in the mid 1950s, I noticed that the Eastern Daily Press and the Eastern Evening News, you know, not tabloids, mainstream local papers, had articles on Diana Dors, you know, weekly, basically. And a lot of it was about, you know, her films, because she seemed to be making a lot of films. It wasn't, you know, all salacious gossip or anything. So I was wondering, you know, if you could talk more about her relationship with the press and the press's relationship with her, why they seized on her. You know, I don't think it's a coincidence that their sort of obsession with her came along when there were lots of nudie shows. They were reviewing lots of striptease shows at the time. And even though they were at least somewhat respectable newspapers, there was always a scantily clad woman or a buxom woman amidst the arts criticism. And then secondly, just methodologically, this might be a silly question, but when you write a book about one person, do you set out to review this person's entire oeuvre from films to television appearances, or do you look for and review a representative sample of their oeuvre? Is there a point where you say, I think I've seen enough? So thank you very much, and thank you for the great book. And I love the tableau back there. I hope it hasn't been sitting back there since 2009.
No. Thank you. That's great questions, actually, two really good questions. I think you said what you saw in the Eastern Daily News when you were at UEA did relate specifically to 1955. And 1955 was a really big year for Diana. And actually, she made more films in that year than she'd made for a very long time. So she made quite a lot of films in 1948, and then very few. She was lucky to make 1 or 2 films a year, but in 55 she makes at least 5 films. So brilliant. So that means she's got a film coming out in the cinema once every 2 months, or just over every 2 months. So she's around, so she's publicizing, she's got something to publicize. So I think that makes her high profile and newsworthy in a way that 2 years before she was really struggling to get out there. But I think it's interesting about the provinces, and I haven't thought about this, and looking at provincial papers, and it might be an avenue worth pursuing. She had done quite a lot of theatre tours in the early 50s, and she got great reviews, and she won awards for her theatre work in a way that she never did with the film. She never got great reviews, and there was only one time she was ever put up for an award, which I think was Yield to the Night and the Palme d'Or for Best Actress at Cannes. So she clearly did raise her profile in the provinces, and people up and down the country were not just used to seeing her in their local cinema, but probably seen her doing public appearances, opening fetes, and appearing in theatres. So I think she really does have a presence across. So before going to your second question, I just want to ask Melanie if she's got anything to add to that.
I suppose, I mean, there's the product tie-ins that she's involved with around that time as well, and Godwin cider. So there's, you'd have a cutout of Diana Dors in, like, on the counter of the pub, perhaps selling this particular brand of cider. Tie-ins with shampoo brands. So there's the prominence of the national press. So she's on the front page of the Mirror several times in 1955, and there's this notorious battle of the bombshells where they kind of compare and contrast Marilyn and Diana. And I think in the end, Diana comes out on top in this sort of blonde off. But she's also got her column in Picture Girl magazine, which is the big sort of film fan magazine of the time. So she's across so many different media. She's also on television as well around this time. She's a recording artist, she's in variety, she's in plays on stage. So I think that the multimedia, multi-platform nature of her stardom means that she is kind of incredibly ubiquitous. But I think Martin's right to sort of identify 1955 as this peak year in a way where everything kind of coalesces, and perhaps from that point onwards is the beginning of things not going quite as well. I don't know. But yeah, the second question about method. What do you think?
Well, gosh, I mean, having been the co-editor for so many of those BFI film stars books, I think there were 19 of them in the end. I mean, and they were only like 40,000 word books. And I think a lot of the authors thought, oh, they were a doddle. I can throw one of those off in 6 months. And I had to say, when they sent their proposal to me, be prepared. This is 3 years work. And whittling it down to 40,000 words is going to be your biggest challenge. Because if you watch even a representative sample of some film stars' work, you know, I mean, some film stars made over 100 films. Are you really going to watch all of those films? Can you get hold of all of those films? You know, and I think it really is important to watch a representative sample. But, you know, I think it's unrealistic that anyone would watch every single film or even be able to track. I mean, a lot of the films have been lost. So, you know, it's far too difficult. But I think certainly things from each era, I think are really important. And if an actor's worked in different genres, I think it's really important to look at how they work in different genres and how they adapt their performance to working, you know, for like children's films or adult films or horror or comedy or melodrama, romantic drama, romantic comedy, you know, just to see how versatile they are, I think is a really important question. So trying to be representative is really important. But what that is, I mean, what proportion of films you would look at. I mean, I would say I've seen more than half of Dors's films, but that's because she only made 67. But only, I mean, you know, that's quite a lot. But I've definitely seen more than 30 films. I can't quite sure, but there are still films that have eluded me that one day I hope I will get the chance to see, and I will follow up on that. But I think that's just the nature, and you can't do everything. So for this book, I mentioned theatre, but I could have gone much further down the looking at the theatre and getting hold of press reviews of the theatre work that she did, because it's an important strand. But I made the decision, this is a book about film and how she worked as a film star, film actor. So I sort of allowed myself to not do too much investigation into that work. So, you know, I think for your sanity and for your life career balance, you know, you have to be sensible and you have to be selective, otherwise you'll drive yourself mad.
Yeah.
I also think that absolutely cataloguing and doing everything, I think that's the kind of film buff type stuff as well. And I think there are some people who kind of write, you know, fan-based stuff in a way that I could never do, who do it brilliantly, and I take my hat off to them. But I'm just not one of those people. So
can I ask, because in the book you've got a number you've got a number of case studies of particular films from different stages of Dors's career, and I just wondered if you could say a bit about how you chose those particular case studies. You know, were there other ones that just didn't quite make the final cut of the book, or how did you decide, with this vast array of things that you could choose from, how did you decide what you'd use as your case studies?
Right, I wanted films that people could see. So if I wrote about them, I wanted them to be able to find them. So I wanted them to be available on DVD or available through streaming services. I couldn't see at any point in writing about a film that nobody can get hold of. So that was one thing. I wanted a film from as many different eras as possible so that you could see Dors's star image and her performance and acting changing over the course of her life. I wanted as many kind of international co-productions as possible. So I tried to pull in things like The Pied Piper, which you might think of as a British film, but actually it's a European co-production, and a lot of the filming was done in Germany. You know, so I was trying to bring in a more kind of European or world dimension. And then I wanted as many different genres as possible. So I've got a romantic comedy, which is the first case study, Is Your Honeymoon Really Necessary, from 1953, 52 or 53. Then I've got a romantic drama, or really a kind of technicolor film noir, which is The Unholy Wife, made in Hollywood. So I've got one of the Hollywood films. And then I've got Berserk, which is more of a kind of horror exploitation movie. And I thought it might appeal to kind of cult audiences, and it allowed me to bring in notions of cult stardom and cult acting as well. And that's from 1967, where her career really is absolutely at a nadir at this point. But to get a film where she stars opposite Joan Crawford and has some amazing kind of confrontational scenes with Crawford, there's no way I could ignore that.
No, you have to include that.
Then Pied Piper from 1972, which is kind of children's fantasy film, but not for children. No child must be allowed to watch that film. And in fact, you know, just after the opening credits, where you see the horses burning and the plague victims, I think you get a sense it really shouldn't show our 7-year-old this film. So quite an ambiguous film in lots of ways. And also a disparaged film. And I think that was the other thing. I wanted to talk about films that were critically neglected, because I think with Dors, there's some fantastic work out there on Dors, which you've done, Melanie Bell's done, Pam Cook has done, Sue Harper's done, Christine Geraghty has done. And it's fantastic, but it does tend to be the same film. So, you know, The Weak and the Wicked, Yield to the Night, possibly Value for Money squeezing in there, but not much on the 70s or the 60s. And I hadn't come across anyone really writing about Is Your Honeymoon Really Necessary, because it's a small independent B picture, but I think has qualities, you know, that lift it. And I think Dors is really instrumental in lifting it out of that category into something more interesting. So I wanted to find films. The Pied Piper, nobody writes about The Pied Piper.
No,
because David Putnam, one of the co-producers, said it's shit. It's one of the worst films I ever made, you know. So, but it's Jacques Demy, you know, directing. I mean, it has auteur status, and it's utterly bizarre, and it's worth looking at again, you know. And it is available on DVD, but I think it's only a region 1 or something. I would love that film to come back into the mainstream and be released on a kind of cult movie label that, you know, people could get easily. And that was part of my agenda, was to try and get films more readily available, like Berserk, and get them screened. You say, I want these films to be shown at the NFT. And I have gone to them and said, look, I think we need a Diana Dors season. You've never done a Diana Dors season. They asked me about a year ago to be involved in curating a Betty Davis season. And I thought, what, yet again? I did one for you back in 2006. You know, you'd done one prior to that. So this is, within my lifetime, this is the 3rd Betty Davis season, but no Diana Dors. You know, I put forward a proposal, and I kind of begged and drew in the contacts I have at the BFI and said, you know, surely this could be really interesting, blah, blah, blah. Yes, it'll help me flog my book, but it isn't just about that. You know, I do think Diana is completely overdue for a season. No interest whatsoever. And eventually they came out and said, what we might do is show one film as part of our silver screen, you know, for the oldies. And I just thought, have you not read Linda Marchant's essay in Lasting Stars, you know, where little mix pop stars are citing Diana Dors images on their social media and claiming her as a really cool icon. You know, there's a much younger generation out there who I think would lap up Dors. Yeah,
I think
it's a huge missed opportunity. But yet again, they won't gamble. Maybe it's like the old producers, they won't gamble on Dors. I don't understand.
Could I just come in again, because we've just got a couple of questions that have popping up in the chat, which is Vicky had a question, and I'd like to give her the opportunity. Plus, anyone else, if you would like to come in with questions now as well, please do feel free, either by raising your hand or putting something in the chat. I'll get to you.
Hello, hi Martin.
Hello.
So nice to see you again.
Yes, so nice. Great that you're here.
Brilliant. I'm so pleased about this. I've got a course on stars, and I covered Diana Dors with Robert Donat. It's always a refreshing change to move from boring old Donat to Dors. But you slightly answered my questions by talking about the Hollywood, and I just wondered what her reception was like in America. And then I had another question, but don't have to answer that, about the TV, whether there's any significant TV appearances or anything.
Her reception in America is my favourite chapter in the book.
Okay.
It's what I really, really enjoyed writing. It was absolutely one of the highlights for me. And actually, I think this is one of the things that decided me on wanting to write a book on Diana about 2009. In that I was doing some research at the Performing Arts Library at the Lincoln Center in New York. And I'd spent several days going through reviews of Bette Davis films from the 40s. And at the end of a long day, I thought, I'll just look to see if they've got anything on Diana Dors. Thinking, it'll take me 10 minutes to see what they've got here. They got masses of stuff. And in fact, I spent the next day just going through what they got on Diana Dors. And to my amazement, they got stuff going back to 1952, when Launder and Gilliatt's 1951 film, Lady Godiva Rides Again, was rebranded as Bikini Babe, a Diana Dors film, even though she's only in the first 20 minutes of the film. But rave reviews and critics really picking up on her. And she's this hot new British talent. They're really conscious of her as this bikini wearing star coming from Britain. And then the next thing, what I found was the write-up by journalists of the two press, press conferences she did when she arrived in New York at the end of June 1956, and then 3 days later, I think, she turned up in Los Angeles and she did another press conference. Well, the reaction to her was amazing. What journalists said about her was just incredible. It's almost flattering, unless you think about what they're actually saying. And it alerted me to this absolute ambiguity about her, that she was both attractive but really unsettling and dangerous, and they really didn't quite know what to make of her. My favorite is Archer Winston, who describes her as a cross between Winston Churchill and an inflatable sex doll.
Follow that.
Just marvelous. And I thought, I've got to write a book just so I can put that quote into it. It's just incredible, and then Joe Hyams has got this syndicated column called Sex and Wit, where he compares Dors to Marilyn Monroe all the way through this, but he does it in this rather snide way that always ends up putting Dors down. And then what happens after that, if you chart the next few months, there's just this constant thing about the battle between Marilyn Monroe and Diana Dors. And Diana is saying, she's starting every interview with, I am not Britain's answer to Marilyn Monroe. I'm completely different and I want to be taken, as myself. But that just sets the tone for one piece after another, which just compares her unfavorably to our Marilyn. And it just becomes utterly toxic. 5 months later, she's virtually hounded out of Hollywood, and you can track it through all of those journalistic pieces where they're no longer ambivalent. I mean, the knives just come out for her.
Fascinating. Thank you.
Great question. Thank you.
Those press conferences are very interesting. I think that I do It's a bit like the Beatles, you know, arriving, the sort of later moment of British invasion, and that same thing of the press conference being the place where your wit and your self-awareness is showcased. But obviously their trajectory develops in a completely different way from what happens to her. But that idea of British stars attempting to crack America is still such a sort of important part of British showbiz mythology. I think that idea that you can, if you make it there, you can make it anywhere. And she's such an interesting exemplar of that.
And that's what she always wanted. You know, that was her end game, was to get to Hollywood, and her whole image and way of being, and I think performance style, was modeled on success in America and appealing. Of course, she barely survived five months, you know, and she left totally despondent. And her failure to take America or succeed in America just haunted her for the rest of her career. It was this massive shadow. And she's only 25 at this point. You know, where does she go? You know, she comes back to Britain on a wet, miserable November day, thinking, well, that's it, I've failed. But I've not only failed, but I've gone on for so long about becoming a Hollywood star that, you know, I can't hide this failure. I can't just tuck it away and say, well, I was never that bothered about being successful in Hollywood. So she's got to live with that. And I think what she does, it's interesting seeing her on chat shows in the 70s and early 80s, because she does turn it around. You know, I mean, she then talks with great pride about being there, and being there kind of at the end of the classical period, you know, and meeting a lot of the great stars who were her role models and icons. And that was the gang she wanted to be part of. And although her two Hollywood films failed miserably and were barely distributed in actual fact, you know, she got to do it. And I think in my chapter on her time in Hollywood, you know, what I tried to put a positive spin on it actually, and think it wasn't just all damaging and negative, because she perfected her image by working with hairstylists, makeup artists, and costume designers who did the best job on her ever, and spent far more money and time working on it. And those images, I think, have become really iconic. They get recycled on websites over and over again. You know, kind of Dors at her peak is often in those Hollywood studio portraits of her, looking amazing. So at least she came back with an enhanced physical image, you know, even if it had done severe damage to her star image.
I do wonder as well, you know, is it partly the bad luck of signing with RKO when they're really on the bones of their arse, and, you know, they're looking for reasons to sever people's contracts. So using the morality clause and the affair with Rod Steiger as a way of kind of backing away. Had she signed with a different studio that was in a slightly healthier position, could her Hollywood trajectory have been very different? You know, there's also a bit of bad luck and an unfortunate choice there as well.
But I still think she was too smart for the time. You know, you could say if she was really smart, she'd have played dumb. She'd have done the Marilyn thing, but she was a smart blonde, and that was her USP. And the more people went on about Marilyn and her comparison with Marilyn, that she was some kind of British imitation of Marilyn, the more she pushed the I am not dumb, I'm actually really smart, I'm very quick-witted, I'm very sharp angle to her star persona. But in 1956, it wasn't doing her any favor, because, you know, that's not where the ideology around gender and sexuality was, you know, so she was out of her time completely. And again, I think she's much more a blonde of our time now, and kind of post-feminism, I think, has really embraced. I mean, feminism embraced Dors towards the end of her life, which I think is one of the great stories about, you know, right at the very end, as she's dying with cancer, but, you know, she's brought into the feminist fold through Steaming, Joseph Losey's film of Nell Dunn's feminist play, award-winning feminist play, and she's in a very strong female ensemble film alongside Sarah Miles and Vanessa Redgrave. But thereafter, she's embraced by feminist film scholars, you know, so Christine Geraghty, writing about her for Charles Barr's British cinema book 2 years after her death in 1986. But I think while she's been embraced by feminist film scholarship, I think post-feminist culture, you know, can really embrace her and take her up. So, you know, I think she was always hitting against the ideological values of the society she was emerging out of in the 1950s.
I think that's very true, but it's also the source of her ability to survive, you know, being a quick-witted blonde with experience of Hollywood and being an older woman serves her well in the kind of endurance of that celebrity image. She's one of those chat show guests that's an absolute gift. She's great across a variety of different sort of light entertainment formats, and that's certainly the way that I encountered her. And I remember her as absolutely ubiquitous, you know, the TVM dieting with all the gold jewelry and the white hair and the pink caftans, and you know, continually on chat shows, continually on television, pop videos, the two Ronnies. And I remember for Christmas, I got one of those Girls World, you know, those heads that you could style the hair on.
Oh, I wanted one of those. I begged my parents, but I had a bloody Action Man.
Well, I had one for Christmas, a Palitoy Girls World head. And I remember my granddad saying, it looks like Diana Dors. And I couldn't quite square this, you know, kind of plasticated, glamorous head with all this blonde hair and this sort of older, overweight lady on the telly. Yeah. So that was an interesting moment of disjunction between this very familiar celebrity who was never off the TV, never out of the papers, and this earlier stage to her career where she was clearly a very different kind of woman and represented quite a different kind of thing that I was smearing makeup on and doing the hair in plaits. So I think, you know, the ubiquity of the later career in a way is a triumph. You know, it might be a bit tacky, but it's admirable that you keep calm and you carry on, in the words of that awful poster.
Mm-hmm. And I love the way you write about her in the 80s, in your chapter in the Female British Stars book, and you talk about her ripeness and her robustness, you know, and it's wonderful because although you can see, you know, she doesn't fit into ideals of glamour and femininity at this point, there's something hugely comforting about her, strangely unsettling in that there's a real sexiness to her maternal aspect. There's this real combination of this maternal and sexy persona. She's not letting go of the sexy persona, even though she's becoming a more maternal figure. But she's also, this is the lovely bit, she's turning into the Albert Hall. You know, she's turning into a national landmark of that kind of stature. You know, and I think that's something that chimes with her persona as the commander. You know, that she's, in that sense, she can take on a kind of militaristic, but it can be camp and it can be earthy and down to earth, but it can be super glamorous and sexy at the same time. And, you know, and again, I think that's what stars do. They bring together all of those contradictory elements and it sort of makes sense. You know, it shouldn't do, but it works and she absorbs it as part of her image.
Absolutely, yes. I mean, I think this might be a nice moment for the unfurling of the Beminked book.
Oh yes, I'd forgotten about the unfurling. So this is the book in its special protective.
Yeah, not all copies come with these accoutrements.
No, this is a one-off. This was made by my friend Suzanne. who also made this lovely waistcoat that I'm wearing. She spoils me with fabulous handmade things. So I did ask her, I said, look, we're going to do this parade of pride in Cannes along the Croisette, and we're going to take the book back to the place where Dors spent the happiest week of her life, representing the British film industry with Yield to the Night back in May 1956. And we're going to end up, and I'm going to release this book to the world outside the Carlton Hotel. So I said, is there any chance you could make me a mink cover? And then we had long discussions about what color. Well, it had to be pink. This is Provençal pink, and it has a turquoise silk ribbon, as you can see, holding it together. And I've sort of put it together like this now because it has a kind of corset. But anyway, so about a month ago, with a fantastic 5 group of friends, I unfurled this upon the world. But I'm going to do this slightly differently, and I think this is a much sexier way of doing it. So I'm going to release the ribbon like that, so that it beautifully releases. And then, ladies and gentlemen, may I present to you Miss Diana Dors.
Bravo, bravo. I think as book unveilings go, that's a pretty special moment there.
Well, it was a bit different, wasn't it, than the usual kind of launching of a book in a bookshop type thing.
I think it's the star treatment that befits someone like Diana Dors.
Yeah, I wanted to do something thinking about how would she do it. And I thought she'd go back to where she was really happy, and she would potentially make a fool of herself parading about, but, you know, she would get attention in one of the most glamorous places. And that's what we did. And I'm, you know, the people who were with me just entered into the spirit of it wonderfully well. And I thought they'd be kind of mortified. But no, I mean, they were worse than me, actually. So no, we had a great time, and it felt very Dorsian, and I could feel somehow she endorsed that approach.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think she definitely would.
A week after that, just to let you know, I then did a reading of the book in the library of a Franciscan friary, which was really interesting, talking amongst you know, a religious community in a wonderful room full of theological books and books on divinity on the shelves. And there I am reading about Dors being described as a cross between Winston Churchill and an inflatable sex doll, and also outlining the plot of Keep It Up Downstairs, one of her great sex comedies of the mid-1970s. But I have to say, the brothers just accepted it all beautifully and asked some really interesting questions at the end of it. So Dors is taking me on a really great journey at the moment, which is very unpredictable, and I'm not quite sure where we're going to end up. So I would like to think it was with the BFI season on the South Bank, but if it isn't, you know, it really doesn't matter, because I'm having a ball with this project.
I think we should lobby as hard as we possibly can.
Please do. If anyone has any kind of power or influence, then I would really appreciate it.
We had a comment in the question that it should be a regional touring show. I think it was Melanie who said that seemed a bit more kind of slightly fitting to what you're talking about as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to kind of really kind of sorry to kind of stop the flow there really, but just to give a sense of does anybody want to kind of come in with questions really? I know Jacob has put one down and I can get to that, but I just wanted to open it really to see if anyone had questions they wanted to come in with.
Or share a memory of seeing Dors and a memorable moment or a first encounter, either real or on the screen. Please come and share your Dorsian moment with us.
I mean, I will kind of jump in at that point just to again, you know, it's probably similar to you, or despite kind of shift in time. My biggest knowledge of Diana Dors is Adam and the Ants, and that kind of that moment, that kind of, I guess, kind of the aging figure. And I kind of wanted to say, it doesn't sound from what you're describing really as if that older Diana Dors was ever a huge kind of grotesque figure in the way that some older stars are. There seems to be something different about her aging body, I guess.
I mean, she was certainly willing to play the grotesque sometimes. So in Deep End, which you offer a really interesting analysis of one of the kind of most unsettling moments of that arty, weird, strange film of the early 70s. She's deliberately playing grotesque in something like The Amazing Mr. Blunden. She kind of uglies up with nose warts and ratty hair, and but yeah, in her kind of everyday persona, it's much more about the maintenance of glamour, the heels, the rings, the jewelry, the immaculate hair. And it was a very interesting form of sort of female embodiment to be so ubiquitous at that time, because it wasn't, I can't really think of anyone analogous really in British culture at the time. She was her own special creation.
I think the great thing about when she put on all the weight, she then broke away from Marilyn Monroe and those, you know, I think that gave her the chance to really become her own kind of sex symbol and totally unique. So I actually think she embraced it, whether consciously or subconsciously, because, you know, she could finally get away from being Britain's answer to Marilyn Monroe. She ended up being truly Dorsian and very unique at that time. There was nobody else like her.
Jacob had just wanted to
Is this where I start reading out sections from the A to Z book?
Just a practical question that Jacob had asked in the chat that I wanted to get to. What archives did you use for the Hollywood and American material? Because we've heard a lot about, you know, the British archives and the British material, but when you looked at her Hollywood career, where did you go for that content?
Yeah, I just went to the Public Library of Performing Arts, which anyone can go into. It's an amazing resource in Manhattan, up near Central Park at the Lincoln Center, where the Metropolitan Opera is and the Juilliard School is. You can just go in there and rifle through their little trays and you go look for a name, and they are sitting on amazing amounts of archival information, whether they're clippings from newspapers or scrapbooks or things that have been donated to them. But they've got stuff on all kinds of performers, theatre performers, musicians, playwrights, and film stars. And so I got a lot of the information from there. That was really an invaluable source for me. I'm going to read the section on Betty Davis in Diana Dors's Beyond Closed Doors, if there are no other questions.
I think that would be a nice way of bringing the different strands of your career together. Yes. I think we had that book in our house. I remember it being, you know, a sort of enticing object.
Yes, well, it would
Didn't have many books, but we did have one of her books.
Right. Oh, that's interesting. Yes, it is the sensational sequel to her #1 bestseller for adults only. So yes, she's got lots of categories. D is for dogs. I won't read that. D is also for divorce, detective, but it's also for Betty Davis. So what does she say about Betty Davis? She says, the lady is, to my mind, the greatest actress and screen personality in the world. See, no wonder I like Diana Dors. I have never had the good fortune of meeting her, although we have spoken on the telephone a couple of times in Hollywood when she was trying to negotiate a film contract for my second husband, Richard Dawson. It has always been my ambition to work with her, but up to the time of writing, this wish still remains unfulfilled. Like her counterpart, Joan Crawford, with whom she appeared in the film Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, Betty is one of the last of the giants in Hollywood. They do not make them like her anymore. The personal life of Betty Davis has also been as dramatic as any role she ever played on the screen, but with 4 marriages behind her, it would seem she's decided not to plunge into matrimony again. The last husband, actor Gary Merrill, looked as though he was the right man for a while, but as things turned out, he too went the way of the others, and judging from the publicity prior to their divorce, it appears to have been a turbulent union which ended in much bitterness. Betty was heard to say loudly to the press and anyone else who cared to listen, "The state of Maine is not big enough for both of us anymore." And presumably on that unhappy note, Gary promptly moved away. You'll have to buy a copy of the book on Amazon if you want to find out what else she has to say about Betty. But there you go, that's just a little taste.
They come highly recommended, those books.
They're brilliant.
As does this book. So I just wanted to say once again, congratulations on a fantastic study of a fantastic star. It's a great read.
What I want to say is that it's been the most pleasurable book that I've written by far. The last book I did, Warner Brothers, was a kind of life's work in which it was stuffed full of archival material I'd been compiling over 30 years. And it was my big project. But I had to fight tooth and nail to get it into the form I wanted it to be, which was just basically sticking to the proposal. And it almost finished me off. And I vowed I was never going to do an academic book ever again. It was so exhausting and unnecessarily time consuming. But people kept saying to me, you should contact the folks at Edinburgh University Press. They're really brilliant. And I thought, oh no, they're all the same, these academic publishers. You know, it's absolutely awful. But it's absolutely true. I mean, they have been a joy to work with. I mean, Gillian Leslie and her team have just been, every single one of them, fantastic all the way through. I don't know what your experience was like, Melanie.
I second that wholeheartedly. Yeah, absolutely.
Brilliant. They've responded to emails within an instant, which is not my experience of other publishers. And they've just been so helpful and so clear and supportive and positive. It really has been a joy all the way through, and I can't thank them enough, and I can't recommend them enough to other people. You know, they are my first stop in terms of any other kind of proposal. So
yeah,
it really has been a joy. And even now it's a joy, you know, just promoting it, talking about it to people. It is absolute pleasure. Dors was my lockdown companion. I mean, I wrote most of the book during lockdown here in this little room. This is my little guest room in my cottage up in Northumberland, but it doubles as my study. And this is a bed just behind me. And this is a tidier version of what it looked like during lockdown, but all my Dors material, magazines, notes, everything was sprawled out behind me. And after a while, it did start to feel like she was just reclining there, dictating this book to me. And I just kind of typed up whatever it was she told me to do. So it was pretty effortless, really, compared to many of the other books I've written.
It sounds like quite an experience.
It has been. It's been a real joy. And just talking about her to other people is such a positive experience. You know, I mean, Betty is different. You know, Betty, it's a different energy altogether working on Betty Davis, but this just seems so much more relaxed and easier. And yeah, joy is the key word.
I think that comes across in the book as well.
I think as well, just to kind of come in again, there is the sense, I think, I'm just going to kind of put myself back in there, that we are in a kind of boom time, and that partly because of the work you've done on the Film Star series, Martin, of volumes on single case studies, basically. And I think, you know, something that's been done for certainly directors for many years, that idea of really delving deep into a career, going beyond the ideas of just image, of thinking about performance, labour, transmedia, all of those things, and having the space to really look very carefully and in-depthly on particular case studies, and not always the most obvious ones, I think, as well. And I would kind of put Dors into this. I go, you know, we've got to kind of think of this, and as somebody who's written 2 books on particular case studies as well, but there is a kind of joy, I think you're right, Martin, in looking at people in that depth. And I just wondered if you'd like to reflect, or anyone else would like to reflect on, you know, we were in this moment of real kind of interest in deep dives, I guess, in film stardom and film performance.
I think there's a joy in getting to know someone in the way that there is in real life. You know, when you meet someone and you make a friend, and it deepens, and you find connections, and you agree on some things and you don't agree on other things. And I think part of investigating a star is a bit like that journey into friendship, really. You know, and you will discover some things you don't like and some things you really do like, and you admire along the way, and it makes you think about yourself as well. You know, I've spent a lot of time thinking about how must that have felt, how, you know, to be treated like that, to be talked about like, not to get that part, how would it actually have felt? You know, so I mean, I found it quite a sort of empathic process, as well as doing kind of nuts and bolts research. And, you know, you think about research methodology, but this is the kind of vaguer area of this kind of work, where you have to use a different part of your brain.
Do you think performance analysis is a kind of empathic process in a way, then, that you have to kind of get into the mind of the performer, and how does that work?
I think it does, because you're looking at the outside stuff, aren't you? You're analysing what someone's doing with their hands, how they're standing, how they look, the expression on their face, and it's all very external. But obviously, for that actor, they are thinking, or, you know, they are in a process of identifying with their character at that moment and thinking, what does this character feel? And they're trying to convey that. And I think someone like Dors does it with enormous subtlety, and I think she does it by just thinking the thought and not trying too hard to express the thought, and allowing it to come through the camera and the microphone. And although that might seem kind of effortless, it takes huge amounts of confidence to be able to do that and get away from the self-consciousness of, here I am standing in front of all these people with the lights on me and the cameras focused on me and blah, blah, to kind of get yourself out of the picture. You know, so she's involved in a kind of empathetic process. And I think to understand what internally is going on for her in that moment in the scene, you kind of have to make that leap as the analyst. You know, you have to stop just looking at the external thing. You have to look at the external things, but then I think you've got to start and reflect on, what was she really thinking about?
Melanie Bell's got her hand up there as well. Do you want to come in on this now?
Just to kind of agree with that. So it's not really a question as such, but I definitely found this working on the Julie Christie book, and that point about doing that kind of deep dive is that you end up living with these people for such a period of time. And writing about, you know, Christie, ended up being hugely impressed, you know, with the way she navigated the industry, you know, and the amount of labor that goes into, we talk about this, but you really kind of feel it, I think, when you do those deep dive projects that you don't when you look at, you know, just maybe a handful of films or a handful of performances. And I do think looking at performance was central to that. So yeah, and it's a joy to have the time to do that. I think in academic scholarship, yeah.
It takes enormous amounts of your time. And so lockdown was brilliant because there were no distractions, really. It was me and Dors, and there was a husband downstairs somewhere, you know, making scones occasionally. But it was me and Dors. And the thing that happens is when you're reading her work every day, reading about her, watching her films every day, and then doing that close scrutiny of moments in films, having selected them and made a decision which ones you really want to look at, then you start dreaming. You start dreaming, Dors, you know, and you hear her words. I would go off in the afternoon when lockdown opened up a little bit and work on my allotment. And as I'd be there weeding or doing whatever it was I was doing, I had Dors' voice in my head the whole time. You know, I'd suddenly have to run and get my little notebook out and write down, you know, all these little thoughts that were coming through. But I could hear her all the time. You know, I'd wake up thinking about Dors. I'd go to sleep thinking about Dors. Well, it just kind of goes into your neural pathways after a while. You know, it is quite obsessive, I guess, but it's, I don't know, you just got to soak it up, you know, and I think that's part of the methodology, is finding a way for you to open yourself up and be receptive to all of that without it making a mess of your own life or making a mess of your own head, you know, which I think it could do.
Yeah, it's a fine line, isn't it? You have to maintain that sense of like the analytical whilst also, yeah, I mean, I suppose it's that thing of being the academic and the fan and the obsessive and the person who's trying to analyze this all at the same time. Then do that in lockdown conditions, and it's probably an especially intense experience.
But it is there is a great payoff in doing it. So, you know, whatever sacrifices you make, however much time you devote to it, you get something back because you are developing a relationship with the person. You might not have met them and they might be long gone, but you are definitely developing a relationship. And I think in some ways that is good for your mental health because you don't feel isolated, you do feel connected, and it takes you out of yourself because you're thinking about the world from somebody else's point of view. You know, you're not just concerned with your own anxieties or your own thoughts or your own kind of day-to-day business. I think that is really healthy. So what Star Scholarship, it saved your life.
Well, I was going to say we've kind of really come to the end of our time, really, and although there are many questions we could kind of go on with it, perhaps the idea of starred studies as being great for our mental health is a nice end point to that moment. So I would just like to say thank you to Martin for providing us the subject of this, for conducting such excellent research and getting it out there, to Melanie for being involved in this and having the conversation about Dors. And I think that real sense of let's take her seriously, which is often what a lot of think of this work is. You come out at the end going, well, we've taken somebody very seriously kind of from this. And thank you to everyone who's come along and asked questions. I know we've had a few people just have to kind of go at the end. So, you know, everyone I think has really kind of enjoyed it, and you can see that in the chat as well there. So I just want to say thank you, and whether you all want the rest of you want to turn your cameras on briefly so these two can see some faces, or put a little kind of clap or a wave up or something like that, just to get a sense, because it's still quite an oddly isolating thing doing these talks. But thank you all for coming as well. Brilliant, yeah, so great. So yes, we will thank you to Martin and Melanie. We will reconvene for similar events hopefully in the future. I think for us as a SIG, one of the next ones we want to do is a discussion on star biopics in the light of something like Blonde coming out. So if anyone would like to be directly involved in that, please do get in touch with myself or Eleonora. But we'll be invited to it nonetheless, one way or the other. So yeah, thank you both.
Brilliant. Thank you, Sarah. That's fantastic for organising this, and thank you, Melanie, for great questions, and for everybody else for being there.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye. I will draw this to an end then. I'll end it in a second. Everyone kind of leaves. Right. Well, thank you all for doing that. Eleanor is kind of there at the end. But yes, I thought that was really great. Thank you so much.
Loved it.
as a
Lovely.
yeah,
Lovely.
as a
Talk about.
yeah, so I think it was really nice to get it as a conversation, and I think for an online session at least it seemed to work quite well. Sometimes they're quite static, aren't they? I think we have a nice balance.
Yes. Yes.
Lovely. Thank you so much. Thank you both for this conversation. And I've taken some amazing screen caps of the